Hello and welcome to the Indiana State Police Public Information Program. I'm your host today, Sergeant Dave Burston, Public Information Officer for the Indianapolis State Police Post. Our subject today is something that should be near and dear to everybody because it refers to our children and the issues and concerns relating to child abuse. We have two very special guests today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Patty Dool, who is the Education Coordinator for the Prevention of Child Abuse chapter of Indiana. Also, we have Jack Vidan, who's a detective with the Indiana State Police with the Indianapolis Post. Patty, Jack, welcome to the program. It's good to have you both here.
Thank you.
I guess the best place to start, Patty, is to get kind of from your perspective of your organization, what's a definition of child abuse?
Well, kind of a generic definition I think that a lot of people can understand is to think of child abuse as a behavior or a pattern of behavior towards a child, either by an adult or an older child, that results in serious physical or emotional harm to that child.
So sometimes a lot of people think of child abuse as maybe just being something physical, but we're talking emotional, psychological, not just bruises or bangs or things like that.
No, you can physically abuse a child, of course, but you can also emotionally abuse them, physically neglect them, and also sexual abuse. They are all forms of child abuse.
And I think that's important for our audience to understand that. Now, Jack, from a law enforcement perspective, there's a much more kind of a sterile or specific type of legal definition. Could you highlight that for us?
That's true, and if anyone has their law books with them, it's under IC 31643. And I think one of the terms that they use more often is number 2, the child's physical or mental health is seriously endangered due to injury by act or omission of the child's parent, guardian, or custodian. To add to what Patty has talked about as far as emotional and physical, of course, you're looking for the bruising, the broken bones, so forth and so on. I had a case not too long ago where a 15-year-old girl, high school girl, athlete, honor roll student, took a sudden plummet in her grades. This was so uncharacteristic of this child that the school officials, rightly so, did a little investigation. And they come to find out that the child's mother was, in the past, had suffered, how can I put this, a mental disease.
Some sort of mental breakdown or
correct.
something?
I think it was depression. And she was taking medication for this depression. Now, as teenagers will, they'll become rebellious. A lot of times they'll become slovenly at home. They'll sleep more, and the
Maybe
mother,
as teenagers can relate to
right.
that. So
the mother took this as this child is suffering the same problems that I have. It's obvious to her that this child was depressed. So what that mother started doing was giving the child the same medication that she was under.
not a very smart thing.
No, and it caused the child to fall asleep in the classroom. It caused the child, in many cases, just not to get up at all, just stay in bed. And of course, the grades dropped, as I mentioned earlier. And so it's not always, child abuse is not always abuse in forms of broken bones and bruises that we often see.
And that's
children.
probably what a lot of people think of. They're going to think of the physical or very traumatic things. So it can be something as unintentional where you can, from a devil's advocate, you can say the mother was trying to help her child, but in a totally inappropriate manner.
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely.
Now, Patty, when we look at your organization, can you tell us a little bit more about the Indiana chapter to prevent child abuse and the kind of things that you're involved in helping to spread the news about child abuse?
Yes, our organization is statewide. We're a not-for-profit private organization. We are actually the Indiana chapter of the National Committee, and the National Committee is located in Chicago. Our mission is to serve as a catalyst to prevent child abuse and neglect in all its forms, thereby enhancing the lives of children and families in Indiana. So our mission is really to educate, to provide trainings, to give information to professionals, families, children, anybody who is, everyone is our public. And our goal then is to prevent child abuse, because we do believe it's preventable, that you can stop the hurt before it happens.
So basically, if somebody thinks that they are aware of a child that may currently be abused, they could call your organization and get some reference or counseling on who to call or what step to take next?
Yes, we do not actually do any investigations. We do, although we do have a referral line that folks can call in on if they have a concern or they're not sure and they want to talk to someone. It's our care line. And they can call in, and then we would refer them to the proper place to report. It is, if you suspect child abuse and neglect in Indiana, it is the law that you must report it to either your local law enforcement or to Child Protective Services. You have no choice.
Now, with that phone number, you mentioned your care line. Can you go ahead and give that phone number for our viewers, and we'll put it up on the screen also.
Okay. Our care line number is 1-800-CHILDREN. And this number is available to folks Monday through Saturday from 8:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. And someone will be there to pick up the call and give them assistance in any way that they need. Parents may also call that line, or caregivers, if they're feeling stressful, need some assistance, aren't sure what to do. We'll have someone on hand to try to help them, and thus maybe prevent a situation where a child is hurt.
Well, you and I had the good opportunity last week. We did our radio show, the Indiana State Police Road Show, and it was during one of our segment breaks that I commented about a very well-known public service announcement. You see the young woman talking in the mirror, and she's saying, the next time you get upset, you calm down, you take a break, take time out. And as the camera moves back, you see that she's talking to herself in the mirror. Mm-hmm. And actually, your organization had something to do with that program.
That particular public service announcement came from our national chapter through the ad campaign, and that is one of our themes is that you take time out. It's like when you give your children time out if they're misbehaving when they're small, and you say you need to take some time out, think about what you're doing. And in lots of instances, if parents or caregivers can just take some time, count to 10, count to 20 before they react to a situation, that can often be enough to prevent an abusive incident.
To what that slap or the hit or even saying something you would regret saying.
Yes.
Now, something else you commented on that I want to get Jack's input on is you briefly touched on the requirements of the law to report. And could you expound on that or expand on that a little bit more, Jack?
Well, currently it's a Class B misdemeanor if you fail to report what you believe is child abuse. Probably the frontline fighters that we have right now that normally are the best ones to report this type of incident would be your physicians, would be school teachers, neighbors, but those two sources, school and
family doctors are usually the best. They're a little bit, even though it can come from other sources, of course, they're looking at this from a third party, a detached view, and they can often see a little more objective point of view.
Right, they can see a child coming in day after day with bruises on its face, shaped in the form of a hand. The doctor, of course, will see mysterious bones that break. A child's bones, granted, they fall off their bicycle, that's going to happen to any child. But the child's bones are still pliable enough that they shouldn't be coming in time after time after time with a new break.
And often, kind of injuries.
Often a physician can see how the mother reacts with the child or the father reacts with the child in the waiting room. And it's all something which one incident alone may not be enough. But
and some of the things that you're bringing up, Patty, ties into directly the type of training and education programs that you provide. I know you provide training for law enforcement. Do you provide information for doctors and school teachers and things to be on the lookout for?
Yes, definitely. That is one of the biggest, well, in fact, that's one of the biggest things that I do at Indiana Chapter for Prevention of Child Abuse, is that I provide and coordinate our education services. I've written a manual for healthcare providers that goes through the whole process of what to look for in all types of child abuse and neglect, what they have to do. I do child protection team training in the state for those that look into incidents of child abuse and neglect. We educate social workers, teachers. I've been going around to all the daycares in Indiana this year, educating daycare providers, because teachers, as
They
he
see the
indicated,
same children on a daily basis.
and they're often the first to see children outside of the family system, especially preschools and daycares. And so they have an opportunity to see children more so than anybody else when they're young. And the young children in Indiana are most vulnerable to child abuse and neglect. And I guess, unfortunately, they are also most vulnerable to die from child abuse and neglect in Indiana from birth to age 3. So those providers of care are the ones we really need to educate.
You know, in bringing that up, I'm sure that there are some people that may be watching the program now that are thinking in their minds about some well-publicized cases where a child has been taken out of the home and it turns out that the case was unfounded. But I think the thing that we need to stress is that is the exception and not the rule. And you, hopefully, after hearing what the law was that you covered for us, Jack, and also from the perspective that you brought up, school administrators, they are in the position where they need to err on the side of safety. If a child comes in with a bruised eye, or with a black eye, and it's an isolated case and it's only happened that one time, they probably did walk into the door jamb or fell off the bicycle. And I think people need to understand that school administrators, the first time they see a child with a bruise, they don't immediately, child abuse, let me call the authorities. It's when they're seeing a pattern of injuries that can't be passed off with just saying it's a clumsy child.
If I can add, some people, one of the reasons they don't want to give this information out is they're afraid they're going to be sued. They're afraid of what the neighbors might say to them. Why are you picking on? You must have some hidden agenda here. There is, by Indiana code, a measure of protection you have if you are giving this information.
The reporting person.
That you're not being, of course, if you're not being malicious. Now, if you're malicious, of course, that goes. There's another penalty for that now. If you're doing this out of spite, that also is it's a false informing. It's also a Class B misdemeanor. But if you have the child's best interest at heart, then of course.
And that's the key point. We're going to be taking a break right now. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more with Detective Badan about what happens when the investigation starts, and we'll talk a little bit more about the false reporting, because this is not something that you make a threat in a divorce situation to try and get even with the spouse, and there are penalties for that. Please stay tuned to these messages, and we're going to be right back.
What a day for love. It's a day for love. What a day for love. It's a lovely day.
The 90s are not the 60s. In a world this dangerous, there's no such thing as a harmless drug. Talk to your kids about marijuana.
Hello and welcome back to the Indiana State Police Public Information Program. I'm your host, Sergeant Dave Burston, Public Information Officer for the Indianapolis State Police Post. And I want to reintroduce our guest, Patty Dool from the Prevention of Child Abuse Chapter of Indiana, and also Detective Jack Badan from the Indianapolis State Police Post. We just closed from our break talking about we were just starting to touch on the issue of malicious reporting. And I'd like for you to comment a little bit more on that, Jack.
Certainly. More often than not, this type of malicious reporting stems from a divorce situation where custody is being fought over. For example, if one family is going to move out of state, the other family is going to stay here in Indiana, and they want to take the child to another state, for example. You see situations
potential
like
for that to
that
happen.
occurring.
And I think the thing that we want to stress to the viewers is if there's a thought that there is child abuse, child neglect, child molestation, everything falling under that umbrella, if there's a feeling that's occurring, yes, you report. And there are protections within the law that will protect people that do make those reports.
Right.
But under no circumstances is this type of law there for malicious use. I'm going to get my spouse, I'm going to be able to get custody of the child, and everything that I'm going to call up and make a report is not true.
That sort of thing hurts the system more than you can imagine. I've been investigating these type of crimes for 8 years, and I'm no longer the idealist I was when I first started taking these crimes, primarily because of that, because of these custody battles that one side wants to claim that their child's been abused, molested, where it may have happened, but the parent may have seen a symptom or something that they see as a symptom of child abuse, but the courts don't always, or the prosecutor doesn't always interpret that as being such. And it makes the investigator a little bit more jaded, a little bit more careful, because to make a mistake, you're ruining a person's name. You just have to be very, very careful.
And it's important that as an investigator that you are judicious in it. But the other side, and we don't want to belittle the point that it is a problem in Indiana. We were talking during our break, Patty, that there are how many incidents have happened over the last couple of years in Indiana?
Well, in fiscal year 1995, there were almost 70,000 children reported to be abused and neglected. Now, in terms of, those are reports. Those are not those that were substantiated, meaning that there was enough information in the course of the investigation to indicate that child abuse or neglect probably had occurred. And that's usually around 50% of what is reported is usually...
So 35,000 are substantiated in some manner?
Perhaps, 35 children.
Okay.
But more importantly, I think, is that the risk of what abuse will do, not only emotionally to a child and physically to a child, is that we know that child abuse and neglect is deadly. 44 children died last year, in fiscal year 95, as a result of child abuse and neglect. And in the previous fiscal year, 56. And if you count back to 1987, there are almost 370 children. That's almost the size of an elementary school in Indiana.
You just hit what I wanted to make sure our viewers were aware of. The numbers you're talking about are in the state of Indiana.
Absolutely.
So that was 44 children last year in 1995 in the state of Indiana, and 56 in 1994.
Exactly.
So the problem is definitely there. Now, Jack, from an investigator's point of view, we had talked before we started the show today that there are circumstances or cases will happen where a parent will bring their child in, or maybe somebody's thinking that's watching the program, I brought my child to the police and the child, in my mind, the child had been beaten or something was wrong and the police didn't do anything. What's your answer to that?
Well, child abuse, child molest investigations, in my opinion, are very difficult. They rate, in my opinion, along murder, along rape, in that you have children that more often than not can't communicate with you, refuse to communicate with you because they've been programmed by their parent, or they've been
traumatized.
Right. A lot of people, they will call the state police after they've had this complaint with a local police department. They perceive that local police department as not doing something. Well, that's not altogether true. Many times it takes 3 or 4 interviews to get the story from the child. You also have to gather your evidence. Evidence is crucial. When you have a report of an abuse or some sort of molest, you want to get that corroborative evidence
From a school teacher, from a doctor?
Well, from a physical examination.
Okay.
And of course, that's not always, you're not always going to have that evidence to make your case.
More times than not, you're not going to have any physical evidence in a molest situation. But
That's true. But it is, when you have it, and when you have a good interview where you're not asking the child leading questions, you try to let the child put this in their own version, using their own terms, it's dynamite. There's no trial. More often than not, there's a hasty plea made by the defendant, and that's the kind of cases we like.
You bring up another area, and I'd like to get input from both of you on this, that nobody grows up learning to lie or not to tell the truth. That's something that is learned, a learned behavior. And from the things that I've learned about child neglect and abuse, that even if the child is being neglected or abused, there's still an attachment or a desire for love and affection from the person that is abusing them, the caretaker, the guardian, the parent. How do you, what are both sides of it, of children fabricating incidents of child abuse or fabricating that nothing's wrong when something is wrong?
I think that's probably, it varies really. I mean, I think it depends on the situation and who the child has chosen to tell about the abuse. And how comfortable the child feels. And a child's life is all the life they've known, if we think of it from that perspective. They don't know what else is different outside of their home until they get older. So depending on what age the child is, what the situation is, what the abuse is, who they've chosen to tell, I think that has a lot to do with how well a child is, or how much they're going to tell and how comfortable they're going to feel with telling. But it's never comfortable to tell, usually, because they're afraid. They don't know what is going to happen. If I tell and it comes out true that somebody knows that dad or mom or whoever has been mistreating me, and then what happens to me? Children are egocentric. I mean, they really are. That's their body is their life, you know, and so for them, they don't know how it's going to impact them. And let's face it, when a child is abused and it's even substantiated, that is not the end. That is not the end for that child. It's not the end for that family. It just often is the start of a lot of pain, of a lot of healing, and that's where counseling is very important. And so, again, the importance of prevention is so important, is so key and paramount to this, because if we can prevent this from occurring, we don't have to worry about the pain and the hurt that occurs with children and families.
And the counseling brings up another point, Jack, from the law enforcement perspective. You recommend that people get counseling,
Absolutely.
don't you?
Absolutely.
Where do they go to get help?
Well, in most cases, the county welfare worker, who is the primary fighter in these type of crimes, will have a list of recommendations for that person to go to. They know who's good. They know who will handle a certain type of abuse, or who's better at handling certain types of molest.
So they're a focal point and they can help guide people from where to go from there.
They are such an integral part of our investigations. More often than not, they will go with me and help interview children, and we rely on them very, very heavily.
We were also talking during the break about what happened with your child, who's now 5, but I think it'd be interesting for you to share with our viewers what happened with you.
Oh, well, I was just saying that one of the things that we try to do from our agency standpoint is to educate about child abuse and neglect. And one of the things that I tell child care workers or preschool teachers or whoever that's working with children and are involved with children is, don't ever assume that an injury that a child has is a result of a fall or an accident or something like that. That you need to, one of the first steps is to ask the question, what has happened?
Just ask the child, what happened?
Just ask the child what happened, or the parent what happened, and listen to the explanation. If it seems plausible, then okay, but if it doesn't, and we often know what doesn't seem right, we often ignore those kinds of things because our stomach tells us, well, that doesn't seem right, but we tend to ignore that. Well, in my particular situation, my daughter was enrolled in a school and she had fallen and hurt her arm, and she wanted to wear a sling, of course, because she was 3, and that's what 3-year-olds like to do, Band-Aids and slings. And but she went to school all day, and no one bothered to ask me what happened to her.
As far as I know, walking around with a little arm in a sling, and
as far as I know, they didn't ask her. Of course, with a 3-year-old, you don't know, but they didn't ask me. I know that, and that was real disturbing to me as a parent, because I think as parents, when we entrust our children, those of us that have to work outside the home, entrust our children to others, I want them well prepared, and I think that's key to prevention. I want them to ask me the hard questions. Put me on the defensive if you have to answer, ask the questions though.
And hopefully when that happens, parents recognize that it's for the right reason.
Well, it's still, even being trained and this being my business, when my daughter broke her wrist also, and when the doctor wanted to know what happened, I started to explain, and he said, no, let her tell me. And I immediately thought, oh, what's he think? And at first I had a defensive reaction to that, as any parent would, but then I thought, oh, thank goodness, because he's asking her, he's doing what he should do. Ask those questions. And the child's old enough, she was 5, she was old enough to tell him what happened.
Good. We only have a couple of minutes left on the program, and I know that there are some other neat things that you're involved with in your program, and one of them is the Kids First license plate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can talk briefly about that. It's not actually our organization, although our organization is thrilled with the Children's Trust Fund.
It's an indirect benefit.
Well, hopefully we will. But what this is the license plates that you see, the unique license plates with the children's handprints. The money that is collected from those license plates is being put into a Children's Trust Fund in Indiana. It can't be touched for anything except for programs about primary prevention of child abuse. What I've been talking about here, education, training for those parents, people who work with children to prevent child abuse. And that money will be available through writing proposals to the Children's Trust Fund Board for those local communities to put some programs into place on a local level for prevention. So buy the Children's Trust Fund license plates, and you can be assured that it won't go towards fixing roads.
Okay.
Although we need that.
We need that too. And I know that I'll be in trouble with you. We've just got about 30 seconds left. Tell us about your blue ribbon.
Oh, yes. I made Dave ask about this. I have. I wanted to point out my blue ribbon here on my lapel, kind of lapel, I guess, and let everyone know that the blue ribbon signifies prevention of child abuse, and I encourage you to purchase one of these and wear it, especially during the month of April, which is Child Abuse Prevention Awareness Month, but particularly wear it all year round. And it lets people know that you believe that prevention is possible and that our children are worth it.
And give that phone number again too.
1-800-CHILDREN.
1-800-CHILDREN, that should be popping up on the screen. And Jack, from the law enforcement perspective on the child abuse issues and neglect, any closing comments you'd like to leave with our viewers?
Just be sure, be careful, and
better to err on the safety and the side of the safety for the child.
Sure.
And that's so important. I mean, we hear it's the cliche-ish thing to say the children are our future, but the fact is the children are our future, and we have to protect them to protect our future. And those of you that have watched the program before, you know that something else I always talk about at the end of each program is safety belts. And that's another form of child abuse. If you're not buckling up your child in the car seat when they're that young, and even when they get older, having them buckle up, you may be eliminating their future completely in the event of a collision. So remember to buckle up. The life you save may be your own or that of somebody you love. We'll see you on the next month's program. Until then, take care. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.